Clara Winters held the telegram, but it wasn't a promise anymore. It was a death sentence. Her fresh start in Timber Creek, Wyoming, had lasted less than a day. Across the table in the hotel dining room, the banker Edmund Harrington folded his newspaper. His face was a mask of cold satisfaction. He was a man who enjoyed swatting flies, and right now she was the fly. "I'm afraid I must rescind my offer of marriage," he said, the words polished and smooth. He pushed a second telegram across the table. This one wasn't from him. It was from Boston. It was the truth. Clara Winters, governess, dismissed in scandal, child born out of wedlock. The words swam before her eyes. "I can explain," she started, her voice a hollow whisper. "There is no need," Harrington cut her off. "Reputation, Miss Winters, is everything. I cannot be associated with your history." His eyes flicked over her, a dismissive, insulting glance that made her skin crawl. He thought he knew her story. He had no idea. "The child died," Clara whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "She lived only 2 days." "Nevertheless," Harrington said, standing. He placed a few bills on the table, not enough to get her home, but enough to make his point. "I have paid for your room through tomorrow. I suggest you are on the morning stagecoach. There is nothing for you in Timber Creek." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Miss Winters," he added, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone, "do not try to find work here. I am this town. Your story is my story now. No one will have you." He walked away, leaving her frozen in a sea of humiliation. The other diners pretended not to stare, but she could feel their eyes, their whispers already starting. Harrington hadn't just rejected her. He had declared war. She had traveled 1,000 miles to escape her past, only to find it waiting for her, weaponized by a man she'd never even met. She had nothing. No money, no friends, no way back. And as the sun set on her first day in Wyoming, Clara realized she wasn't just ruined. She was trapped. By morning, despair had hardened into a cold, sharp point of determination. Returning to Boston wasn't an option. She would rather starve in the dirt of this frontier town than crawl back to that city of whispers. She approached the hotel proprietor's wife, Mrs. Peterson, a woman with kind eyes but a nervous tremor in her hands. "I'm looking for work," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "Anything. A teacher, a seamstress." Mrs. Peterson wrung her hands, glancing over her shoulder as if Harrington himself might materialize from the shadows. "Oh, my dear, news travels fast. Mr. Harrington has made it difficult. He had poisoned the well. Every door in town was already closed to her." "Isn't there anyone?" Clara pressed, a lifetime of polite society crumbling under the weight of sheer desperation. "Someone outside of town? A ranch, perhaps?" Mrs. Peterson hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "There's one place," she said, her voice barely audible. "The Blackwood Ranch, 5 miles west." She looked up, and her kind eyes were filled with pity and fear. "His housekeeper left a month ago. He might be hiring." "Thank you," Clara said, relief flooding through her. But Mrs. Peterson wasn't finished. "Miss Winters," she warned, "be careful. Mr. Blackwood, he's not a friendly man. He lost his wife 3 years back. Awful business." She leaned closer. "Some folks in town say he drove her to it. They say the ranch is cursed." The supply wagon driver, a teenage boy named Jimmy, confirmed the warning as they rattled out of town. "Blackwood Ranch," he'd said, his eyes wide. "Fair warning, ma'am. That place ain't right. The man keeps to himself. A hard man. Mean, some say." The landscape shifted from rolling hills to a more rugged, unforgiving terrain. The sun beat down, and the hope Clara had felt moments before began to wither. Finally, Jimmy pointed. That's it. The ranch house was a sprawling, two-story structure of dark timber and gray stone, nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress. It was a place built to keep the world out. Clara descended from the wagon, her small valise feeling impossibly heavy. The air was still, too still. No birds sang, no ranch hands called out. There was only the sound of the wind whispering through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound. She gathered her courage, marched up the wide porch steps, and knocked. The sound echoed, swallowed by the silence. She knocked again, harder. Heavy footsteps thudded from within. The door didn't creak open. It was wrenched back, revealing a man who stole the air from her lungs. He was a giant, well over 6 feet, with shoulders as broad as the doorway. His dark hair was too long, his face weathered and carved by sun and hardship. A faded scar cut through his left eyebrow, giving him a permanent scowl. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were a strange burning amber, and they looked at her not with curiosity, but with a weary, knowing anger. "What do you want?" he growled, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. I'm Clara Winters," she stammered, recovering her composure. "Mrs. Peterson sent me. She said you might need a housekeeper." His gaze flickered past her, to the empty yard, to the road leading back to town. He saw everything in a single sweeping glance: her worn dress, her single bag, the desperation clinging to her like dust. Then his eyes snapped back to hers. "Harrington," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. He knew. He already knew everything. Clara lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed. "Yes." He studied her for a long, silent moment, and she felt like a horse being appraised at auction. She felt judged, weighed, and found wanting. She expected him to slam the door in her face, to tell her to get off his land. Instead, he stepped back. "Name's Yates Blackwood," he grunted. "House is a mess. Cooking's worse. Pay is fair. Quarters are private." He stared her down, his amber eyes unblinking. "Job's yours if you want it. But you don't cause trouble, you hear me? No trouble." The offer was abrupt, cold. It wasn't a rescue. It was a transaction. And as she stepped over the threshold, the massive wooden door swung shut behind her with a final, echoing boom. It sounded like a cell door locking. She was in, but she had a terrifying feeling she might never get out. The house was worse than a mess. It was a tomb. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, a gray shroud that muffled sound and stole the light. Dishes were piled in the sink, crawling with insects. The air was stale, thick with the scent of neglect and something else. Sorrow. It felt like a place where someone had died, and the living had simply walked away. Yates led her up a narrow back staircase to a small bedroom. "This was the last one's room," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Bathroom's down the hall. My rooms are at the front. Don't go there." He turned to leave. "Dinner's at 6. And then he was gone, his heavy boots echoing down the hall before fading into the oppressive silence. Clara sank onto the narrow bed. What had she done? This place felt wrong, haunted. She unpacked her few belongings, trying to bring some semblance of order to the small room. As she smoothed a dress into the rickety wardrobe, her fingers brushed against something tucked away on the top shelf, hidden behind a stack of old linens. It was a small, leather-bound book, a diary. She opened it. The handwriting was neat, feminine. Eleanor Collins, May 1875, the previous housekeeper. The first entry was dated just a month ago. Arrived at Blackwood Ranch. "Mr. Blackwood is a silent, brooding man. The house has a sadness to it. A deep, chilling sadness." Clara flipped through the pages. The entries grew shorter, more frantic. He watches me. I feel his eyes on my back, even when he is not in the room. He never speaks of his wife, but her presence is everywhere. A portrait in his office, her clothes still in the closets. The last entry was a single, terrifying sentence, the ink smudged as if written in haste. I found something in her room. He knows I know. I have to get out. The diary ended there. Eleanor Collins hadn't just left to care for an ailing sister. She had fled. Clara's blood ran cold. She was in the house of a man whose housekeeper had disappeared after uncovering a dark secret. A man the town believed had driven his own wife to her death, and she was utterly, completely alone with him. For a week, Clara walked on eggshells, the unspoken secrets of the house pressing in on her. She cleaned, she cooked, she brought order to the chaos, but the chilling atmosphere remained. Yates Blackwood was a phantom in his own home. He would appear for meals, eat in silence, and vanish again into the forbidden front rooms of the house or out onto the ranch. He barely spoke to her, but she always felt his presence. She would be scrubbing the floor, and a creak from the hallway above would tell her he was there, watching. The diary was a hot coal in her pocket. What had Eleanor found? What secret was hidden in the late Mrs. Blackwood's room? The door was always locked. On Sunday, the ranch hands were due for dinner. Clara prepared for them with a knot of dread in her stomach. She expected rough, simple cowboys. She was wrong. 4 men stomped onto the porch, their faces hard, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. Yates introduced them with grunts. Tom Sullivan, the foreman, was a man with a cruel twist to his mouth. The Wilson brothers were hulking and silent. The youngest, Daniel Cooper, looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They sat at the dining table like a panel of judges. The meal was a tense affair. Tom Sullivan watched her every move. "Boss ain't had a woman in this house for a while," he said, his voice a low drawl loaded with insinuation. "Last one left in a hurry. Got too curious, I reckon." It was a clear warning. Clara met his gaze, her hand steady as she poured him more water. "I'm here to do a job, Mr. Sullivan. Nothing more." The men exchanged glances. Yates sat at the head of the table, his face a stone mask, offering her no support. He was letting them test her, letting them see if she would break. After they'd eaten their fill and left, Daniel Cooper, the young one, lingered behind. He approached her as she cleared the plates, his eyes darting toward the door. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Just be careful. Tom and the others, they're loyal to the boss, loyal no matter what." He swallowed hard. No matter what he did. The boy's words echoed in the empty room. They didn't just suspect Yates of something terrible. They knew, and they were protecting him. The secret wasn't just his. It belonged to the whole ranch. And now, she was in the middle of it. Clara knew she was in danger, but leaving was not an option. She had no money, nowhere to go. Her only hope for survival was to make herself indispensable. She threw herself into her work with a quiet fury. She cleaned the house until it shone, tended the neglected garden until it produced vegetables, and cooked meals that were simple but delicious. She also started going through the ranch's account books, which were left in a disorganized heap in the main parlor. They were a disaster. But Clara had a mind for numbers. She spent her evenings deciphering the messy ledger, organizing receipts, finding errors. One night, Yates found her at the dining table, surrounded by papers, a lamp burning low. He stood in the doorway watching her, his silhouette a dark, intimidating presence. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough. "Your accounts," she said, not looking up. "Whoever was keeping them before was either a fool or a thief. You've been overpaying your supplier in Cheyenne for 6 months." She pushed a corrected ledger across the table. "You can save nearly $200 on your next order." He picked up the book, his large calloused fingers tracing the neat columns she had drawn. He was silent for a long time, studying her work. The air was thick with tension. Finally, he looked at her, and for the first time, the anger in his amber eyes was gone, replaced by something else: surprise, maybe even a flicker of respect. "My wife, Catherine," he said, the name sounding rusty on his tongue. "She used to do the books." He sank into a chair opposite her, the first time he had ever willingly sat with her outside of a meal. "They told you in town how she died, I suppose." "They said she was ill," Clara said carefully. He let out a short, bitter laugh. "They lie. She wasn't ill. She was sad. A deep, bone-deep sadness that this place couldn't cure." He stared into the darkness outside the window. "She took her own life, in her bedroom, the one I keep locked." The confession hung in the air, heavy and cold. "The town, they needed someone to blame," he continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A rich man like Harrington can spread whispers like a sickness. They said my temper, my silence, drove her to it. They called me a monster. It was easier than admitting that sometimes people just break." He finally looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "Now you know," he said softly. "Now you know what kind of man you're working for." He wasn't a monster. He was a broken man, living in a house of ghosts, condemned by a town that didn't know the truth. But as he stood and walked away, leaving her alone in the lamplight, a new, more terrifying thought took root in her mind. If he hadn't driven his wife to her death, then what had? What secret was so terrible that a woman would take her own life and a housekeeper would flee in the dead of night? The answer, she knew, was still behind that locked door. The revelation changed things. The fear Clara felt was still there, but it was now mingled with a strange, unwilling flicker of sympathy. She saw the pain behind Yates's hardened exterior. She saw a man drowning in grief, isolated by lies. The ranch hands noticed the shift too. Their hostility softened into a grudging respect. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She was the one who had made the boss talk. She was the one who had brought a glimmer of life back to the dead house. But the peace was fragile, and it was shattered by the arrival of a familiar, hated figure. One afternoon, a smart buggy rolled up the long drive to the ranch. Edmund Harrington stepped out, dressed in his fine city suit, looking utterly out of place in the rugged landscape. He didn't come to the house. He stood by the fence, waiting, knowing she would see him. When Clara stepped onto the porch, he gave her a smug smile. "Miss Winters," he called out, "I've come with a proposition." Yates appeared from the barn, his face like a thundercloud. He walked to stand beside Clara, a silent, powerful guardian. "You're not welcome here, Harrington," Yates growled. "This is a private conversation," Harrington said, his eyes fixed on Clara. "I've discovered my decision was hasty. I am prepared to overlook your past indiscretions. My offer of marriage still stands." Clara stared at him in disbelief. This man's arrogance was boundless. "You think I would marry you?" she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "After you tried to destroy me?" Harrington's smile vanished. "It's either me or this," he sneered, gesturing at the ranch, at Yates. "The wife of a banker or the servant of a murderer. Because make no mistake, that is what they call him. And I will spend every last dollar I have to make sure that story sticks. I can ruin him, Miss Winters. I can take this ranch, this land, everything. And I will, unless you come with me." It was blackmail. He was threatening to destroy Yates to get to her. "Get off my land," Yates said, his voice dangerously low, "or I will remove you." "Think about it, Clara," Harrington said, climbing back into his buggy. "Your reputation, or his ruin. The choice is yours." He rode away, leaving his poison hanging in the air. Clara looked at Yates, saw the fury and the helplessness in his eyes. Harrington had found his weakness. He had found the one thing in the world Yates might still care about protecting. And now, she was the weapon being used against him. That night a storm rolled in, a violent, terrible storm that mirrored the turmoil in Clara's heart. Wind howled around the house like a banshee, and rain lashed against the windows. They sat in the parlor, the unspoken threat from Harrington, a third presence in the room. The tension was unbearable. "I should check the barn," Yates said suddenly, needing to escape the suffocating silence. "A new foal was born yesterday." "Not in this," Clara protested. "It's too dangerous." "I'll be fine," he said, grabbing a heavy coat. She watched from the window as his lantern bobbed across the yard, a tiny spark of light against the raging darkness. He was gone for a long time. Too long. The knot of fear in her stomach tightened with every crash of thunder. Finally, she couldn't wait any longer. Grabbing a shawl, she plunged out into the storm. The wind tore at her, the rain blinding her, but she pushed on toward the barn. She found him at the far end, lying on the hay-strewn ground. A fallen beam from the loft lay across his leg. His face was pale, his teeth gritted in pain. "It's broken," he gasped. "I can't move it." Panic seized her, cold and sharp. They were miles from town, from a doctor. He would die here if she didn't do something. "We have to get you back to the house," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She tried to lift the beam, but it was too heavy. Using a smaller piece of wood as a lever, she strained, her muscles screaming, until with a final desperate heave, she managed to shift it just enough for him to pull his leg free. The journey back to the house was a nightmare. He leaned on her, his weight immense, his every step a symphony of pain. They staggered through the mud and driving rain, half carrying, half dragging each other. They collapsed into the parlor, soaked, freezing, and exhausted. His leg was mangled, the bone clearly shattered. She knew enough about injuries to see it was bad. She cut away his trousers, cleaned the wound as best she could, and splinted the leg with firewood and strips of linen. He watched her the whole time, his amber eyes clouded with pain, but also with a dawning awe. "You saved my life," he whispered as she finished. "We saved each other," she replied, her own strength failing her now that the crisis was past. She slumped into a chair by the fire, shivering. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice urgent despite the pain. "Harrington, he won't stop. He'll destroy this place to get at you." "Then let him try," Clara said, a fire igniting in her chest. She looked at this broken man, this outcast, who had offered her shelter when no one else would. "I'm not running anymore." Yates reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't had anything to fight for in a long time." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not just gratitude, but something deeper, something she had never expected to see again. "Stay," he whispered. "Don't stay as my housekeeper. Stay as my wife." The proposal was born of desperation and pain, a shield against the storm both outside and the one Harrington was bringing down upon them. It wasn't about love. It was about survival, a partnership, a pact. And in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of the storm, Clara knew it was a pact she had to accept. "Yes," she said. The word was a quiet promise in the heart of the storm. The doctor arrived the next day, a grim-faced man who confirmed Yates's leg was badly broken. It would be months before he could walk on it again. The ranch was vulnerable, and Harrington knew it. News of their sudden engagement spread through Timber Creek like wildfire. It was a scandal. The disgraced woman from Boston marrying the town pariah. Harrington was furious. He saw it not as a marriage of convenience, but as an act of defiance. and he began to make good on his threat. First, the suppliers in Cheyenne suddenly refused to extend credit to the Blackwood Ranch. Then, the local feed store mysteriously ran out of grain, but only for Yates's men. Harrington was choking them, cutting them off, trying to starve them out. The ranch hands, who had once been suspicious of Clara, now saw her as their only hope. With Yates confined to his bed, Clara took charge. She ran the house, managed the now dwindling supplies, and handled the accounts with a shrewdness that surprised everyone. She found a new supplier in a town further north, paying cash from her own meager savings. She organized the men, her quiet authority and sharp mind earning their loyalty. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was the mistress of the ranch, fighting for its life. But the pressure was immense. Every night she would sit with Yates, going over their dire situation. In these quiet moments, their partnership deepened. He taught her about the ranch, about the cattle, about the land. She, in turn, read to him, her calm voice a balm to his pain and frustration. A strange, tender intimacy grew between them. One evening he reached out and touched her face, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. "I asked you to marry me to protect you," he said softly. "But the truth is, Clara, you're the one protecting me." But their fragile peace was about to be shattered completely. A letter arrived, postmarked from Boston. The handwriting was elegant, familiar, and filled Clara with a dread that was colder than any Wyoming winter. It was from him, the man who had ruined her, the father of the child she had lost. He had heard she was in Wyoming, and he was coming. His name was Julian Whitmore, and he was not just coming for a visit. He was coming to finish what he started. He had never faced consequences for what he did to her, and now, hearing she had found some semblance of a new life, his cruel vanity couldn't allow it. The letter was a simple, chilling message. "I'm coming to claim what is mine." He didn't mean a reconciliation. He meant ownership. He saw her as his possession, a loose end he needed to tie up. And he was coming to Blackwood Ranch to do it. The world tilted on its axis. It was no longer just Harrington and his financial war. It was something far more personal, far more dangerous. Her past wasn't just following her. It was hunting her. Julian Whitmore arrived not in a dusty stagecoach, but in a private carriage, accompanied by two hired men who looked more like thugs than valets. He was handsome, charming, and utterly soulless. He strolled onto the ranch as if he owned it, his polished boots leaving marks in the dirt. He found Clara on the porch and smiled, a predator's smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Clara, my dear," he said, his voice smooth as poison. "You've led me on quite a chase. This rustic life, it doesn't suit you." Before she could reply, the front door opened. Tom Sullivan and the Wilson brothers stepped out, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. They flanked her, a silent, menacing wall of loyalty. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "I see you've acquired some farm animals as pets." "State your business and get off our land," Tom said, his voice flat. "My business is with her," Whitmore said, his charm dissolving into raw anger. "She is my responsibility. She is coming back to Boston with me." "I'd rather die," Clara said, her voice shaking with rage. At that moment, another buggy appeared on the road. Edmund Harrington, the two villains of her life, converging on her sanctuary. It was a planned attack. Harrington climbed out, a stack of papers in his hand. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice triumphant. "As of this morning, I am the holder of your banknote. It seems your previous lender had a sudden change of heart." He held up a paper. "And I am calling the note due. In full. Immediately. You have 24 hours to pay, or I foreclose." It was the final move. The checkmate. They had cut off his supplies, crippled him, and now they were taking his home. And as for you, my dear, Harrington said to Clara, a slimy smile on his face, when this ranch is mine, you will be out on the street. Again. But Mr. Whitmore has offered you a more comfortable arrangement. Whitmore stepped forward. You see, Clara, you have a choice. You can be a beggar in the wilderness, or you can be my mistress in Boston. I'll be quite generous. The humiliation was absolute. They were stripping her of everything, leaving her with an impossible choice designed to break her spirit completely. She looked from Whitmore's cruel face to Harrington's greedy one. They thought they had won. They thought she was the same scared, broken girl she had been in Boston. They were wrong. Inside the house, she heard a noise, the scrape of wood on wood. Yates appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on a pair of crudely made crutches. His face was pale with effort, but his amber eyes burned with a righteous fury. "You will not touch her," he growled, pulling himself to his full, imposing height. "And you will not take my home." Harrington laughed. "You can't stop me, Blackwood. You're a cripple, and you're broke." "You think this is about money," Yates said, his voice low and powerful. "You think this is about land." He took a painful step forward, planting himself in front of Clara. "You came here to destroy a woman you thought was weak, but you're about to find out what happens when you corner something you don't understand." The confrontation drew everyone out of the woodwork. The rest of the ranch hands gathered behind Yates, a silent, grim-faced army. Even young Jimmy, the supply boy, who had just arrived, stood with them, his eyes wide. Harrington and Whitmore were taken aback by the united front. "This is pointless," Harrington sputtered. "The law is on my side." "Is it?" Clara's voice cut through the tension, clear and strong. She stepped forward, past Yates's protective stance. She was done hiding. "Mr. Harrington, you called my husband a murderer. You spread lies about him to isolate him, to make him vulnerable, so you could steal his land. That is not just gossip. It is a crime." Then she turned to Whitmore, her eyes blazing with a fury that had been simmering for years. "And you, Julian, you think you can just arrive and claim me like a piece of property. But I have a letter you wrote me, begging me to be discreet about our situation. A letter where you admit the child was yours." Whitmore's face went pale. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Clara said, bluffing with every ounce of courage she had. "It's in a safe place, with a lawyer, along with a full account of how your family paid to have me silenced and driven from Boston. It was a lie, but a brilliant one. He couldn't be sure. The seed of doubt was planted." Seeing his ally falter, Harrington pressed his advantage. "This is nonsense. The foreclosure stands. The ranch is mine." Just then, another rider appeared, coming hard up the road. It was the town sheriff. Jimmy, seeing what was happening, had ridden like the wind to fetch him. "What's all this, Harrington?" the sheriff asked, dismounting. "Just collecting a debt, Sheriff," Harrington said smoothly. "Perfectly legal." "Not quite," said a new voice. Mrs. Peterson from the hotel stepped forward, her face set with a determination no one had ever seen from her before. She held a small, leather-bound book in her hands. The diary. Eleanor Collins's diary. "I found this in a room Miss Winters was renting after you threw her out, Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Miss Collins, the housekeeper before Clara, she wrote all about you, about how you were pressuring her, threatening her. You wanted her to find something in this house, something you could use against Mr. Blackwood." Mrs. Peterson opened the book. "She writes here that you offered her money to say she saw Mr. Blackwood mistreat his wife, to lie, and when she refused, you threatened to ruin her family. That's why she fled, not because of him, because of you." The crowd murmured. The sheriff looked from Harrington's sweating face to Yates's stoic one. The lies were unraveling. But it was the locked room that held the final secret. With the sheriff present, Yates gave Clara the key. "Open it," he said. The room was just as Catherine Blackwood had left it. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and on the writing desk was a letter, a suicide note. In it, Catherine wrote not of a cruel husband, but of a deep, consuming depression, a sickness of the soul she could no longer fight. But there was more. She wrote of the constant prying visits from Edmund Harrington, who claimed to be a friend, but was always asking about Yates's finances, planting seeds of doubt, trying to turn her against him. He had been trying to get his hands on the ranch for years, even before her death. He had preyed on a sick woman's vulnerability. He was the monster, not Yates. The truth was out. All of it. Harrington's plot, Whitmore's cowardice. It all lay exposed under the harsh Wyoming sun. Harrington tried to bluster, but the sheriff cut him off. Conspiracy, blackmail, witness tampering. "You're finished, Edmund." Whitmore, seeing his advantage lost, tried to slink away, but Yates's voice stopped him cold. "You're not going anywhere." Yates looked at Clara. "What do you want to do with him?" This was her justice, her decision. Clara looked at the man who had caused her so much pain, the ghost that had haunted her for so long. She could ruin him, she could send him to prison, but she saw him for what he was, a small, pathetic coward. "I want him to leave," she said, her voice steady, "and never come back. I want everyone to know what he is. His reputation was all he ever cared about. Now he has none." Defeated and exposed, Whitmore and Harrington were run out of Timber Creek, their names synonymous with disgrace. The cloud of suspicion over Yates Blackwood finally lifted. He was not a murderer, but a victim, and Clara was not a fallen woman, but a hero. As the dust settled, Yates turned to Clara, his crutches forgotten. He reached for her, pulling her into an embrace that was filled with all the words they had never said. It was no longer a partnership for survival. It was a bond forged in fire, built on trust and sealed by justice. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a home, their home. And as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Clara knew her journey was finally over. She hadn't just found a place to hide from her past. She had found a place to stand and fight. She had found a man who saw her, all of her, and loved her not in spite of her scars, but because of them. She had found her justice, and she had found her love. A love that was real and rugged and as vast as the Wyoming sky. If you were moved by Clara's fight for justice, hit that subscribe button, because every story of survival deserves to be told.